Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm just going to pull up my presentation and we can get started. So today I will be talking with you about trauma and grief and really life after loss and the pathways to resilience. My name is Claire Mraz. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. And I'm from EveryStep Grief and Loss Services, home of Amanda the Panda. Just a brief overview of what I'll discuss today. I'm going to give a little insight into Amanda the Panda and what our program is all about. We'll cover a number of types of grief and loss that exist, and then we'll dive a little bit deeper into considering grief as trauma and really the many layers to looking at grief through a lens of trauma and through a trauma-informed lens. So we'll transition to talking about trauma-informed care and grief, how we can approach grievers with trauma-informed practices. And finally, we'll talk about resilience, what creates and builds resilience in folks that have experienced trauma or grief, and tools for support, what we can do in our everyday lives to support the folks around us. So just a little bit about me before we get started. Like I said, my name is Claire Mraz. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I majored in gender, women's, and sexuality studies and communication studies from the University of Iowa. So that's kind of my educational background. In my professional background, I've spent 5 years in youth empowerment programming and just shy of 2 years in grief support services. Really my why, or what brings me to this work, where I find meaning for myself in this work is breaking down the stigma that exists around grief. You know, grief is a universal experience and there's still so much stigma around it. So I'm so glad to be talking with y'all today because, you know, every time we talk about grief and the grief experience, we can normalize that and break down some of the mystery and the fear and the stigma around it. A little bit of history about Amanda the Panda. I won't get into in depth with you, but we were founded in 1980 by Joanne Zimmerman. We originally, Amanda the Panda was created to support families after a diagnosis of pediatric cancer, but as you can see in the early 90s, we really took on that role of bereavement support across the spectrum of family roles and causes. We partnered with HCI VNS in 2014, which is now EveryStep. And our mission is to provide innovative grief support to families, individuals, and children that have experienced the death of a loved one. Little overview of EveryStep as an organization. You can see the number of programs, or the types of programs we provide, care and support services and programs that we provide. We actually have programs that reach Iowans in all 99 counties of the state, and there are 32 EveryStep programs in total, but you can see sort of an overview of the type of care and support that we provide, and really because of that spectrum from birth, childhood, adulthood, and after death. That's really why we like to say that we're with you at every step. Our programs at Amanda the Panda specifically, you can kind of catch a glimpse of them over on the left-hand side, but all of our programs are free. We serve ages 5 on up through the lifespan. And our focus is primarily on peer support, centering experiences that include sharing stories of our grief and deaths that have happened in our lives, building community with one another, with fellow grievers, and building healthy coping skills. So we do that through programs like our overnight camps, our day camps, our 6-week support groups, which include some more specialty groups for adults that have experienced loss, so our traumatic loss group, our Little Footprints perinatal and infant support group, and our college loss group. We also do sort of like one-off evening events like our socials, which are self-care based activities for folks to come together and try something new, have fun. Our Living with Loss Dinner Club is actually a smaller group. It's for 12 adults. They'll gather over a meal and share stories of their loved one. I also provide school-based and community-based support groups. So anytime that there's a significant loss in the community, or if a school is grieving the loss of a staff or a student, I can be a consultant really to provide grief support services however that community might need. And lastly is Cheerbox. So anybody can be nominated to receive a Cheerbox by visiting our website, but it's really a box of 12 individually wrapped meaningful items that are delivered to families after they've experienced the death of a loved one. We deliver them every year in early December, and it's really just that annual reminder that, hey, this time of year can be really difficult and people in the community are thinking of you. So, diving into the topic of grief, grief, of course, there's a definition for grief in the dictionary, but grief really, it's a lot of things. It's universal, it's misunderstood, it is still stigmatized, it is something embodied that we like feel in our physical bodies, and it's unique to every person. So, there are a lot of types of grief. I'm actually just going to cover 7 sort of common types of grief. First up, we have normal grief, with emphasis on the quotation marks, because there really is no such thing as normal when it comes to grief. There's no template or particular timeline to be expected. We've broken that myth that here are the 5 stages, you go through them right in order, this is how long each will take. But really, this just means it's that, like it says, a grief response that falls under an extremely broad umbrella of predictability, so including physical and psychological symptoms. Next would be anticipatory grief. And that's really the reaction to a death that comes before a person has died, when you learn that they're dying. So the anticipatory grief can really feel confusing or guilt-inducing for folks experiencing it, but it's really normal actually to mourn or grieve while a person is still living if we know that they are going to die. And actually, people who are going through the dying process themselves can also experience anticipatory grief, the loss of their own life. Complicated grief is also known as chronic, delayed, or distorted grief. Folks can be more at risk for this type of grief if they're already living with depression, anxiety, or other mental illnesses, but support is available, and I'm going to talk more about complicated grief later in the presentation. And lastly, cumulative grief, just like it says there, when somebody experiences a second loss while they're still grieving a first, it's sort of that domino effect, or sometimes called bereavement overload or grief overload. Moving on, we have collective grief. And at this point, we're all so familiar with collective grief. 2020 has been full of it. Everything from the pandemic, the lives lost to the pandemic, and the sense of normalcy and connection that was lost due to the pandemic. We've also experienced the death of many public figures, like Kobe Bryant, Chadwick Boseman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the really like social uprising that has been happening, particularly in protest to the Black lives taken by police violence. So collective grief mourning the lives of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. Also, like the terrorist attacks that happened, like the Christmas bombing in Nashville. So we've really been experiencing a lot of collective grief in 2020, and can probably think of additional examples beyond that. Next, we have traumatic grief. So typically this is what folks think of when there has been a sudden or dangerous or surprising experience that causes a death. So, a car accident or a natural disaster. Folks experiencing this type of death, this type of grief from death, often have additional layers of coping to process through. And next we have disenfranchised grief. So like it says here, this is the type of grief that can occur when a death is stigmatized. So for example, if the cause of death was a stigmatized cause like HIV, AIDS, or suicide or overdose, that person might feel disenfranchised grief. If their relationship is considered insignificant by sort of society at large. So folks will experience disenfranchised grief if perhaps the death was their an unmarried partner, or they've experienced a miscarriage. It does not mean that that loss or that grief is any less real or less important, or weighs any less heavily on that person. It simply means that the way society looks at that loss comes with some stigma. So those are types of grief. Types of loss are also, it's such a broad concept, but just a couple of types of loss that I want to touch on would be beyond death, of course. So a non-death loss. So this could be the loss of a significant loss of trust, a loss of a job, loss of home, and this experience is going to be different for everybody. So some might feel, this is minor and manageable, and others might feel like this is earth-shattering, and it really takes an impact on them. Secondary loss is really the sort of the ripples in the ripple effect from a death or a loss. So it can, like I've written here, losses related to the changes that come with the death of a person. So if your partner died and they were the primary earner in your household, that financial strain is a secondary loss. Maybe they were your go-to, confidant. So your loss of a support system, loss of physical intimacy, or loss of holiday traditions that come from our family members. Those are all would fall under secondary loss. An ambiguous loss is really grieving somebody who's alive. So this often happens when a person profoundly changes or disappears, is no longer there in our lives, or our understanding of them changes. So this could be discovering that a partner has had an extramarital affair, or maybe somebody's living with dementia or has experienced a traumatic brain injury, and so their way of being and your connection with them has profoundly changed. That could be an example of ambiguous loss. So we've covered types of grief and types of loss, and I want to move into some of those experiences of grief in Iowa. Here's a look from Judy's house. Every year they put out this childhood bereavement estimation model. So this is the Iowa 2020 report, and it uses data from 2014 to 2018. And it shows us here that 1 in 17 children in Iowa will experience the death of a parent by age 18. So just as we're thinking about the impact of grief and trauma in our communities, keeping this in mind. Taking a look at the leading causes of death in Iowa, what types of grief experiences folks have experienced, so that we, can have a picture of what types of trauma they've lived through. So for youth 24 and under, the most common causes of death are accidents, birth-related conditions, suicide, birth defects, and homicide. And for adults 25 and up, the leading causes are cancer, heart disease, accidents, suicide, and liver disease. So putting this in the context of trauma, I really appreciate this quote from Bessel van der Kolk. So I'm just going to read that to you here. He says, "Trauma is an experience that basically leaves people stuck in a state of helplessness and terror. Trauma starts with the feeling of, oh my God, my life is over. Mind and brain become overwhelmed, resulting in a change over how you perceive danger and what you consider relevant and irrelevant to your survival. Trauma is about being in a state where you feel that nothing you do can stop what's happening to you." Now think about all of that in terms of death of a significant loved one. It's pretty easy just thinking of that quote, thinking of how we understand trauma and what do we experience when someone we love dies, to see how those go hand in hand. Now, looking at trauma a bit more closely, you may be familiar with primary trauma versus secondary trauma. So primary trauma comes both from intentional traumas like combat or assault, as well as unintentional traumas like natural disasters, accidents. All of that would be under the umbrella of primary trauma. Secondary trauma is that sort of once removed. So it's trauma that somebody experiences after sort of secondhand accounts or processing or listening or supporting others who've experienced primary trauma. So thinking about counselors, therapists, friends and support systems that have been around folks who've experienced a lot of trauma, they sometimes can embody and then experience trauma themselves from that process. Trauma in the brain, this might be an image you're familiar with, but thinking about the two sides of our brains and how they help us process life events. So we know the right-hand side of our brain is our creative, spontaneous center. It's really our centers for feelings and emotions. And the left side of our brain is really where we house our sense of logic, our linguistics. It's our linear thinking, I'll do this first and then this next and then that last. It's where we do our pros and cons, our risk processing. So In a healthy brain, as you see in the picture, there are bridges connecting the two sides so that when a person's going about their day, making decisions, interacting with others, they can access both sides. They can tap into thinking and feeling at once. But when somebody has experienced a trauma, like the death of a loved one, those bridges are either damaged or destroyed completely. And that really just depends on the person, their brain, and a number of other factors. But trauma will cause damage to those bridges, and often that can leave somebody stuck either on one side or the other without being able to access both. So they might be in a decision-making moment or a stressful moment and can only access their feelings or spontaneity, or they can only access pros and cons or sort of logistics without tapping into their emotions. And really both sides are critical for us living our healthiest lives. Thinking about grief as trauma, hopefully you can see how examples fall across really all of those areas of grief and loss that I've previewed for you so far. But often we know that grief is only considered traumatic by others. It's only, categorized as traumatic loss if it's connected to a death, and particularly if that the cause of death was sudden or violent or unexpected, like the examples here on the screen. But grief as trauma goes far beyond that, beyond thinking of just homicide, suicide, accident related deaths. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit here on the next slide, but I just want to give a trigger warning that on my next slide, so for about the next minute or two, there will be mention of racial and gendered violence. So going beyond sort of our typical first thought of what types of grief or trauma, it's important to recognize that collective grief, cumulative grief, and generational trauma has been experienced and is being experienced by historically marginalized or oppressed communities. So I want to lead with this quote from Professor Timothy, where she writes, "Grief is a direct result of racism and intersectional violence, and it affects us physically, emotionally, financially, spiritually, transnationally, and transgenerationally. More importantly, not being able to fully engage in our grief is a direct outcome of chronic experiences of racist violence." Another quote to kind of put that in context of this idea of the types of grief and loss that are traumatic for folks. Her quote reads, "Insoluble grief, anti-Black racism, and other forms of violence that Black, Indigenous, and racialized people deal with can result in chronic, prolonged traumatic health issues. These issues can include diabetes, high blood pressure, heart attack, cancer, and low birth rates." So when we think about this, it's important not only to name that all of those experiences are completely valid causes of grief and loss, but it's equally important for us to recognize and name the causes. Racism, sexism, homophobia, those types of oppression cause these real life grief experiences for folks. So I'll leave you with, it's really just another layer of mindfulness, especially for those of us that carry privileged identities, to be mindful that these are grief experiences being carried by so many communities in our world and in our neighborhoods, in our states, in our communities. So when we're interacting with and supporting folks, it's really critical to be mindful of that and be mindful of the roles that we play in supporting them. So thinking about it, another example would be the quote, "It's not traumatic to be transgender, it's traumatic being trans while living in a transphobic world." So again, thinking about the different identities that people carry and the different experiences of marginalization and privilege and oppression that they may interact with on the day-to-day and how those can contribute to their grief and trauma. Moving on to some of the physical symptoms of grief, again, thinking about grief as trauma and the trauma response that comes from death of a loved one. Megan Devine's book, "It's Okay That You're Not Okay," is a great resource. So here's a quote from that. She writes, "Grief is a full body, full mind experience. Studies in neurobiology show that losing someone close to us changes our biochemistry. There are actual physical reasons for your insomnia, your exhaustion, and your racing heart. Respiration, heart rate, and nervous system responses are all partially regulated by close contact with familiar people and animals. These brain functions are all deeply affected when you've lost someone close. So again, walking through those examples, some of the really common physical symptoms of grief include exhaustion and insomnia, dreams and nightmares, physical pains and aches. Again, it's still really important to see a doctor if you're experiencing some of these physical symptoms and feel concerned, because there's nothing saying that there might not be other underlying medical causes, but grief can bring up these physical symptoms as well. Weight changes, so fluctuations, weight gains, weight loss in response to grief. The phenomenon sometimes called grief brain, which is really a collection of symptoms like difficulty focusing, mental exhaustion, memory loss. In the book, and just examples from folks, it'll be, you put your car keys in the freezer, or you go to get in the car and forget why you did it and where you need to go. I would just prompt you, note how many of these responses to grief are similar or overlap with responses that somebody might feel after other types of trauma. So thinking about the physical responses, we also want to think about, grief in the brain, grief trauma in the brain. And again, a quote from Megan Devine in her book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. She writes, in grief, your brain has to codify and collate an impossible new reality into itself. The data presented doesn't make any logical sense. There has never been anything like this event, so there's no way to connect or relate it to anything else. Like your heart, your brain resists this loss. It can't possibly be true. Those blips and gaps in your memory and thought process are the brain trying to make data fit into a world that cannot absorb that data. Eventually, it will understand that this loss can't fit inside the structures that used to be. It will have to make new pathways, new mental relationships, wiring this loss into the person you are becoming every day. You aren't crazy, you aren't broken. Your brain is busy, and it will simply take a while to come back online. Eventually, your mind will realize that the car keys do not belong in the freezer. So I share that with you just as we're considering grief in the brain, grief as trauma, and we start to pivot towards how do we rebuild, how do we move forward, what is life after loss, what is pathways to resiliency, thinking about our brain going through this process of rebuilding those bridges, of forming new bridges, new ways of understanding and incorporating the fact of this loss into our lives. So this slide here, complicated grief, is from the DSM-5. And I mentioned complicated grief earlier in the presentation, but it really is a short explanation for complicated grief are the painful emotions. Painful emotions are so long-lasting and severe that you have trouble recovering from the loss and resuming your own life. So I'm not going to read all of the symptoms out to you on the screen. You can read through those yourselves. But complicated grief is, when we think about, going back to the beginning, thinking about normal grief, when we think about that umbrella term of normal grief, there is a time period where a person experiences acute grief. And acute grief is that short term or that immediate after the death of a loved one, that all encompassing, all mind, all body, having to, sleep all day and can't process what's going on around you and still grappling with this new reality and unable to believe it. That's that time of acute grief. And that length is different for every person. But eventually folks start to build those new bridges in their brains and incorporate that loss into their life and continue putting one foot in front of the other. For some folks experiencing complicated grief, for folks who could be, diagnosed and supported through complicated grief, it means that those symptoms, that experience of acute grief, have stretched on and on and on and on, and their brain is not in the process of building those new pathways. So it's important to know that this is a real experience. Complicated grief does happen, and when it does happen, there is help available. So at Amanda the Panda, we do an optional screening for complicated grief for our adult participants, and if somebody screens likely that they are experiencing symptoms of complicated grief, we would make a referral to a local therapist or mental health counselor so that they can get that additional support outside of the peer support group setting. So putting all of these pieces into practice and supporting the people around us, it's important that we consider trauma-informed care as a practice. Trauma-informed care is really about shifting from the question, when we see challenging or unique or like sort of survival instinct behaviors out of folks, instead of asking what's wrong with you, like what's going on here, it's shifting to asking what have you experienced. So if we see somebody put their car keys in the freezer or sit in the car and go, I have no idea what's going on here, or trail off their sentence in the middle of a meeting, instead of what's wrong with you, we might think, what have you experienced? And considering that grief, loss of a loved one, is a trauma. So looking at it through that lens, there is a whole rigorous training and education process involved with becoming certified in trauma-informed care. But really, I believe that this shifting from one question to the other can be made by most anybody looking to provide better support to grievers. So you'll see below some of those core concepts or practices involved in trauma-informed care. So we have safety. What can you do to provide notions and feelings of safety for the people around you, physical and emotional safety? What ways can you provide them with choice? So a bit of control over their lives. If somebody has experienced a significant death or loss in their life, they're likely feeling like so much is out of their control and they didn't have a choice in that matter. And so how can we provide them with choice in their life now? How can we provide them with a sense of control? When we look at collaboration, how can we make decisions with that individual? How can we share power? Again, going back to that sense of control, where are the places in their life where they can make decisions, where they can say what's what and how they want to spend their time and where they want to spend their time and what they want to do with their energy and their emotions and their body? How can we collaborate and work together? For trustworthiness, if we are a support system in somebody's life who's experiencing grief or other traumas, it's important for us to be clear and consistent in what we're all about. So if it's really just reducing chances of shock, chances of surprise that take away those senses of control. So if I say I'm going to do something, if I say, hey, let me pick up some groceries for you, I know it's been a hard week, it's really important for me to stick to my word and show that I'm trustworthy. I can be dependable. I'm not somebody who's going to just disappear from their lives or change and go back on my word. So that's a bit of consistency, task clarity, interpersonal boundaries. Being trustworthy is also being honest about what's mine and what's yours and where can I help and support you and where I can't. So it's okay to not be somebody's everything and somebody's answer to every single struggle. It's okay to draw that line and say, I wish I was in a place today where I could come and sit with you, but I'm also really struggling today. Can I touch base with you tomorrow and we can check in then? That's okay. Having those boundaries shows that you're a trustworthy friend or trustworthy support that wants to be there for them. And for empowerment, we really want to prioritize what are the ways that I can empower this individual to feel their best self, to feel strong, to feel capable, to feel like they know what they're doing and they know who they are. Because when we lose somebody that we love, all of that can feel so up in the air. I don't know what my life is about. I don't know what I'm doing. Suddenly I have all these decisions to make and tasks to complete, and that can feel overwhelming. And so to be empowering, we really want to tap into who is this person? What do they value? What do they care about? How can I support them there? How can I uplift them? We want to provide affirmation, comment on the things that you admire about that person. Share with them what makes them special. Ask them for help from time to time, gauge of course if they have capacity, but hey, you're really good at this. I was going to try it this afternoon. Like, would you mind helping me out? Do you have capacity? Do you have space or energy to help me out with this? Things like that. Different ways we can empower individuals is really tapping into who they are, what are they about, and showing them how important and unique that is. So I want to touch base with y'all on what is our culture of grief? So I would ask you to think about when you hear the word grief, when you think about the grief process and what you've learned about that, what messages has society provided you with to understand the concept of death, loss, and grief. Kind of think through what comes to mind for you. Take a second and think about what images, what ideas are brought up when you think about grief. So I'm guessing potentially some of the ideas here on the screen, but maybe some others, some really sort of classic scripts for grief or understandings for grief that our culture here in the US has taught us are the 5 stages, right? So we've probably, many of us have heard about the 5 stages of grief. When somebody dies, you're likely to go through these 5 stages of grief. They'll happen in this order. And I think the myth of the 5 stages is the idea that it's just steps, right? Or it's like check boxes that you can mark off in your grief process. So first I'm going to experience this emotion. And once I'm done, I'll move on to step 2 and experience that emotion. The 5 stages really paints this picture that there is an end point, that you will go through your 5 stages in order, and then you'll come out on the other side and you've grieved. Past tense, it is done. It's not how grief works. The emotions of the 5 anger, bargaining, denial, those emotions, those feelings are absolutely real and valid and are definitely a part of the grief process. But the idea that it's linear, that there's a start and an end point, is just not how grief is experienced for most people. So I really will talk about those feelings. Those feelings are all part of the mix, but you might feel all of them at once. You might feel one emotion right away after the death, and then months later you feel it again, and months later you feel it again. So it's more of a cycling, and there's no straight line through grief. Also, sort of debunking that myth that grief has a start and an end point. Of course, like I mentioned, there is that acute grief period where our brain is still trying to process and absorb this new reality. Some of those everyday tasks or our energy levels or our sort of typical self is completely shaken and altered. So of course that is like a timeline and a stage. Everybody's lasts a bit different length of time and that sort of thing, but the grief itself sticks with us forever. When we lose somebody that we love, that grief becomes a part of our life. So thinking back to creating those new pathways, we incorporate that grief into our lives. It now becomes a part of who we are. So it's not something that we can just check at the door once we've reached our 5 stages. Again, thinking about a grief timeline, think about messages that maybe we've taken in without even thinking about what's the appropriate timeline for grief, or what if somebody's spouse or partner dies? What's the assumed timeline of when are they gonna move on? When will they be ready to date? Will they get married again? When is it appropriate? Is there a time when it's too soon for them to go on a date? Is it, oh, it's been too long, you really should get back out there? All of those ideas point to the fact that we believe there's a timeline. Or even thinking about students, how long is a student given to sort of have that buffer time where we'll be lenient on homework, we'll be lenient on tests, but it's been X number of months. We really need you back on track, even though that student's grief is still with them. So just for us to be mindful of the ways that everyone's grief is different. It is a lifelong process. Of course, there's acute grief, and then there is sort of our long-term adapted grief, but it's a lifelong process, and just being mindful of some of those assumptions that each of us may have learned or may make, and the expectations that we set for grievers. Our culture of grief also stigmatizes grief. We know this, despite the fact that it's a universal experience. If a human forms an attachment to another human, if there is a significant relationship, we're all mortal, and humans die, we all die. And so when we have relationships and attachments to others, it means that at some point in our life, we'll experience grief. And yet there's so much stigma around grief and around death. And talking to grievers, often grievers will say, I feel like a burden when I walk into a room once people learn that I'm grieving, because they don't know how to act around me and it makes things awkward or uncomfortable. So I try to hide my grief, or I try to put on a happy face because people feel uncomfortable with my grief. There's stigma around particularly around certain types of death. Thinking back to, our example of traumatic loss at the Man the Panda traumatic loss group, those individuals have experienced death of a loved one due to suicide, homicide, overdose, a number of reasons. And they particularly will speak to the stigma that they feel and that they experience from society, when really they're grieving as well. The cause of death, of course, shapes and impacts our grief experience, and it impacts the ways that we can build those pathways, build those new bridges, and incorporate it into our lives. But our grief response, the pain that we feel, this new reality, this processing, the physical, the emotional, the spiritual symptoms of that grief are in common across all types of causes of death. So thinking about stigma and different ways that we can break that down, and I'll touch on that more later. This next bullet point here, our culture of grief, most of us have never been taught what to say or do. So this sort of taps into what I was saying about grievers feeling like, oh, I'm a burden because people don't know what to say around me, or they don't know what to do. I don't know about any of you, but I work in grief support services, and to be quite honest, I've even had moments where I need to fill out a sympathy card for somebody, or I want to send a letter and let them know I'm thinking about them. And sometimes it's just like, I don't know what to say. And part of that is because in our culture of grief, many of us have never been taught what to say, or we've never been taught what to do. Or the things that we have been taught, bring over a tray of lasagna or send flowers. That doesn't comfort every single person. And so our options often feel limited. Do I send a card? Do I send flowers? Do I send food? Do I make a donation? It's kind of where our list ends for thinking about those sort of traditional scripts and what we've been taught how to respond to grief. Some of those common sayings, I'm so sorry, or my condolences. Our options are too short for the way that grief is so universal. And so again, things that we can do, we can learn from grievers who are willing to share their story, who are at a point in their grief where they're maybe writing or reflecting or creating about this experience. We can read the research that's out there. We can read the blogs that are out there, and learn, how can we be better supporters to grievers? What can I say? What is, if there's not a card that I can pick up at Walgreens that really says the right thing, and I'm going to go ahead and write my own, what do I say? Like, how do I tap into where that person is at and not diminish how they're feeling and not gloss over it and not shy away from it? Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just sit with somebody in their grief and acknowledge, this is horrible. This is terrible. I'm so sorry you're going through this. I'm here with you. You're not alone. Right? Allowing for that pain is often much more comforting than looking ahead to the future, looking for hope, looking for the silver lining, looking for gratitude. I'll touch more on that later, but when we've never been taught what to say or do, and we want to be better supporters, there is information out there, and there are ways that we can really sort of keep things real, keep it real with grievers, see them and meet them where they're at, and not shy away from their pain. And lastly, thinking about our culture of grief, the way that, like, how people grieve, there's cultural notions there and some stereotypes that we've been taught, women grieve in this particular way and men grieve in this particular way. And therapy is a great option, but are there certain genders or races or classes, right, of folks and communities where therapy is more stigmatized or is less accessible? Absolutely. So just being mindful of some of these cultural notions of grief and grief support that we've been taught, and how we can see through that and get real about grief. Now, looking at resilience. Resilience, as it says here, is the capacity to adapt successfully in the presence of risk and adversity, and to bounce back from setbacks, trauma, and high stress. So you'll see here on the image, there are 5 key resilience factors outlined for you. So they're listed as the ability to take care of yourself, active problem solving skills, meaning and purpose, social support, and maintaining a positive outlook. So I want you to think about different examples of those experiences that maybe you have in your own life or that you've seen people around you really embody, and how that's contributed to their resilience. Now, when I think about those categories, I'm actually going to change the wording up a little bit just to get a bit more specific about grief. But I would translate those categories to self-care, skill building, meaning and purpose, sense of community. And for positive outlook, I'm really going to take that and dive into that in the ways that it means breaking through grief stigma and validating true grief experiences. So, self-care and skill building. When somebody is going through grief and experiencing grief and the trauma response that can come from that, sometimes our self-care or our coping skills go out the window. And so as supporters, we really want to focus on reteaching this skill of self-care, uplifting that as an important coping skill. How can we provide concrete examples of coping skills and support? So, basic coping skills like hygiene and sleeping and nourishing our bodies, as well as some of those other maybe less obvious coping skills like therapy or exploring new hobbies, pursuing creative expression, that sort of thing. All of those are great building blocks for building resiliency after trauma. Meaning and purpose. Meaning and purpose is absolutely not about the silver linings. If we're supporting somebody who's grieving, helping them tap into meaning and purpose is not saying everything happens for a reason. It is not saying the universe never gives us more than we can handle. The platitudes are not helpful, because what that tells grievers is, hey, right now I see that you're focused on pain. I see you're focused on sadness, and what you should focus on is gratitude, right? It brings in an element of shame, even though our intentions are so good when we say those things. We're trying to comfort somebody who's in pain, but often it can bring up feelings of shame if we're trying to tell them how to feel, because it means what you're feeling now is not appropriate. So avoiding silver linings is a really good thing that we can do. What we can do instead is help them process the loss in the context of their own life. Again, so rebuilding those bridges, helping them integrate this data, this new reality of life without their person. Ways that we can do that: speaking the loved one's name. You will hear from folks who care to share about their grief that it means a lot to them when other people speak their loved one's name. A lot of times folks worry about, oh gosh, am I going to remind them, or am I going to make them sad, or is bringing it up not helpful? Oftentimes that person's name and that person's memory is already on their heart. It's already on their mind. And so to hear somebody else speak their name or speak about that person can be really validating. Another way to support meaning and purpose is to include them in rituals. So, examples like, is there a song or a playlist that you can put on or share with that person, or that, encourage them to make for themselves that reminds them of their person or their memories with them? Or thinking about adapting traditions or discussing traditions to incorporate the loss. Traditions can be a really big area of people's lives that changes after a loss. So I'll give an example of that. Thinking about grief and how everyone's grief is unique. What that means is that oftentimes traditions are shared, right? Thinking about like a family system, all the members of that family might come together and experience traditions in the same way year after year. But when somebody from that family system has died, everyone's grief response is different. So For one person, it might be so important to keep every detail the same. I don't want to change everything. I want this tradition to remain the same. For another, they may be like, I do not have the capacity to go through this tradition how we always do and pretend that things are normal, because nothing is normal. Our person is gone. Another person in that family system might want to keep some elements and change others, right? And so discussing that and making a game plan is really important and really helpful for folks who are navigating, first time, second time traditions after the death of their loved one. And as a supporter, we can help talk them through that process or encourage them to take part in that. But incorporating the loss into traditions can be really meaningful or really purposeful for grievers. So do you set a place at the table for the loved one? Do you light a candle for the loved one? Do you have their photo on the mantle while you gather? Or this next bullet point, gifts, donations, and advocacy. If your holiday or tradition includes gift exchanges, do you purchase a gift with that person in mind, with the deceased individual in mind, and donate it to a local shelter? Or instead of gifts, do you gather donations to be made in their honor to a cause that they care about? Or, do you advocate for different causes or issues that they believed in or that they were affected by? Different ways that we can foster a sense of meaning and purpose that helps incorporate the data or this new reality of life after loss into our lives. And next would be sense of community. How can we foster a sense of community for somebody who's grieving, or how can they foster a sense of community for themselves? Peer support. So online, there are so many folks who've taken to the internet to share their grief experience, to tell about their loved ones, to tell about their grief, to tell about their coping. There's great information out there to help folks feel less alone and part of a greater community. There's also support groups, of course. So thinking about whether it's in-person groups or virtual groups like we provided Amanda the Panda, or virtual groups or chat groups that are out online or in the community. For families and caregivers, a sense of community is how can we make folks feel less alone in their grief within their family systems, is to talk about it and acknowledge that everyone's grief is different, and that's okay, focusing on validating our grief experiences. So oftentimes caregivers who are grieving will say, if I have to cry, I try not to cry in front of my kids, or I'll step into the other room to cry, or I'll hold it in all day and then cry at night. And when our children don't see us grieve, it tells them, oh, maybe that's what being strong looks like, or maybe that's what I'm supposed to do. I'm modeling myself off my caregiver. Maybe I'm not supposed to cry. And so modeling that it's okay to grieve and to have these grief responses as adults in front of kids can be really helpful. For some folks, connecting with the wider community through social media is comforting. So sharing photos and memories of their loved one, sharing about the anniversaries of the death or birthdays, things like that on social media can foster that sense of community. And then things we might be familiar with, events, memorial events, walks, and 5Ks are all examples. And last of those 5 themes, positive outlook. I have put this one in quotes because it is not the toxic positivity or the be grateful or the silver linings theme that title might imply, but it really is about positive outlook. In this case, in terms of grief resiliency building, is about removing the shame and stigma. How can we validate? How can we normalize and remove some of that shame? So talking about how grief is normal, right? Breaking the idea of stages and timelines. So validating it's okay to still be having a hard day 3 years later. They were important in your life. Take all the time you need, right? Those kind of things. Or acknowledging it's okay to cry in your car, it's okay to cry at work, or talking about grief and death and loss just in the same way that we talk about weddings and anniversaries and birthdays. We don't often have stigma around those topics, and we can do the same for grief. Next would be talking about the huge spectrum of grief and loss types that exist. So I've previewed a number of those for you, and now whether you were aware of them before or not, talking about them is a great way to reduce some of that stigma. Next would be validating feelings. That's a great support tactic anytime we're interacting with somebody who's struggling or going through some challenges, is validating their feelings. Listen for the feelings that they're sharing with you and validate back, that's okay, that's good, that's normal, you're not alone. And lastly, for breaking down stigma and removing shame, working within our communities to support and uplift folks who are grieving. So also as care providers and supporters, become aware of any of those stereotypes or biases that you may hold, some of those examples that I've shared earlier, and challenge those within yourself so that we can really be as trauma informed and inclusive as possible. Lastly, what can you do? So thinking back to a couple slides back with our culture of grief, how can we challenge those setbacks? How can we challenge those notions or those assumptions, and also center those 5 areas of resiliency skill building? Some of those ways we can do that is incorporating death and grief talk into your normal vocabulary. Treat it as normal. So there's, some like stereotypes or ideas that people will whisper. They'll whisper when they talk about grief, or they don't want to say that person's name, or they don't want to say the cause of death. Or when we talk about someone who's grieving, maybe our voice changes and our head tilts and we just only talk like this. And it shows this isn't normal. This isn't how I normally talk. But if we can talk about, gosh, you're having a really hard time. I see that. You must really miss that person. If we talk in the same normal voice that we do, we're signaling what you're going through is normal. So little changes like that we can do. Another idea is follow up long after the casseroles have stopped. We know that, in the immediate days and weeks after a loss, someone's likely to get all of those acts of care. They're going to be getting cards in the mail and flowers and food. But what we know from grievers is that support often trickles off after just a couple of weeks or months. So even if you don't have a great memory, if that's not your thing, set a reminder in your calendar, write yourself a note, put it in your phone 3 months later, 6 months later, 9 months later, every year on the anniversary, every year a week before the anniversary, checking in with that person. And they'll really appreciate that you remembered, because I can guarantee you it's going to be on their mind and on their heart. And so to know that they're not alone with their grief, somebody else remembered and is thinking of them, can make a big difference. Again, I've said it before, but say their name. Say, hey, this is going to be your first birthday without your brother. How are you feeling about that? Right? Or like I said, say the name of the person. Or I was thinking of so-and-so the other day. I was thinking of your person the other day and just wanted to let you know. Putting words to the fact that their memory still lives on is really, really supportive and important. Again, how to support grievers and be more grief sensitive and change that culture of grief is modeling emotion talk and vulnerability to those in your circle, talking about your feelings, asking others how they're feeling, creating a safe space to do that, particularly in spaces that may not traditionally support emotion talk. So thinking about along lines of gender, it's seen as much more common and acceptable for women to share their emotions with one another, but much less acceptable, stereotypically in our culture, for men to take part in emotion talk. And so if you're a man, model that. I'm going to share my emotions and I want to check in with you about your emotions, because it's a big part of our grieving process. And if we don't have practice in that in other areas and other times of our lives, how are we supposed to tap into it when we're grieving? So we can definitely take steps by setting that model in advance and for others. We can also expand our own toolbox for self-care. Same idea. If we're grieving, we need to have access to that toolbox, those self-care, those coping skills. And if we don't already practice those really regularly in our lives, it's going to be that much harder if we're grieving. Same thing for grievers. If I'm a support system for somebody who's grieving and I'm not, practicing what I preach or practicing self-care, how are they supposed to take my advice or take my support that when I suggest that they try a coping skill? A final idea would be to really find ways that you can perhaps leverage your own power or privilege wherever you can, whether that's in your business and your workplace, whether it's in your faith community, in your neighborhood. An example of that would be bereavement policies. In the US, we don't have the most progressive bereavement policies. A lot of companies have little to no leave available for folks after the death of a loved one. And that can be really stigmatizing or devaluing of the real pain and grief that we feel after a death. And so what can you do? Who can you speak up to? Who can you advocate that before somebody needs it? How can we change this policy so that they're supported? How can we incorporate support settings or self-care as an option in our workplace, in our faith center, in our neighborhoods? tons of ideas for all the different areas of our lives that we can really be stepping forward and modeling healthy grieving and modeling accessible support for people who are grieving. That brings me to the end of my presentation, y'all. I hope you've learned something new here. If you have questions or comments or feedback for me, I would love to hear them. Please don't hesitate to reach out. You can reach me at my email address, which is right here on the screen. If you'd like, you can, open up the camera on your phone, and if you just hover over the QR code on the screen there, it should open up an email to me. So you've got that right in your phone, or you can take a picture of the screen. But additionally, if you're interested in learning more about the free resources at EveryStep Grief and Loss Services, feel free to reach out to me there as well. Thank you so much for having me.